Okay, so first I thank the organizers for inviting me to speak at this wonderful conference. Now, actually, Tali's question was very appropriate because I have the term neural codes here. However, I hate this term, and I don't think it should be there. The reason I use the term neural codes here is because it's so popular and widely used, but I think that it's a misnomer and it shouldn't be used in the context of perception action systems. But that's another story. So let me start with some motivation briefly, and I should say that biological systems are closed-loop control is ubiquitous in biological systems, from subcellular levels up to organismal levels and beyond organisms. This is, of course, one of my favorite sensory motor control systems in the world. Now, motor systems, biological sensory motor systems and control loops in biology in general are characterized by huge levels of complexity, being nonlinear, stochastic, distributed, partially observable, blah, blah, blah. You could go on forever. Any type of complexity you could think of appears in biological systems. Yes, yet in many cases, biological systems perform control at a very effective level. Now, if you look at the theory of optimal control from the engineering systems theory perspective, it provides us with a beautiful conceptual framework for control theory, but a limited set of tools to deal with the types of complexities that characterize biological systems. So if one looks at the kind of standard depiction of sensory or perception action cycle in biological systems, one often finds that it can be well described. And actually, if you open many neuroscience papers about motor control, they have this kind of block diagram depictions of sensory motor control, which are familiar to any engineer working in control theory. Now, the main issues in biology is that it seems to be a very nice engineering design diagram. However, in biological systems, there is strong evidence for extensive top-down influences. Now, it's not exactly clear what bottom-up and top-down is in a closed loop system, but from my perspective, bottom-up is something which is usually coming from the external world, from the sensory. But this is an issue one can debate. Now, there are multiple brain areas involved, and these areas are reciprocally connected in many intricate ways. So while this provides a very nice framework for viewing biological systems, it is obviously an approximation. So to start with a perspective, I always like quoting a beautiful paper by Emitter as given at a plenary lecture about 10, 15 years ago. And fortunately, we have Sanjay, who is sitting here today with us, and he gave a lecture called System Science, the Convergence of Communication, Computation, and Control, which I think is very much in the spirit of this conference. And the point here is to say that there does not exist a correct representation of the system and environment to be inferred. Rather, how to represent sensory signals and what inference algorithms to use depends crucially upon the control task. So this, I think, really implies that the whole structure of what we mean by representation in general systems and in biological systems specifically depends to a large extent on what the system is doing with the information. And this has been emphasized in multiple talks during this conference. Another quote which I would like to set in the same slide with this comes from an experimental group of David Ostrey, who have been doing experiments trying to relate the sensory and the motor peripheries of the system. And they have presented several experimental findings, which I will describe briefly, shortly, claiming that motor learning affects not only the motor system, but also involves changes to the sensory areas of the brain. So in this sense, really, both of these descriptions, coming from very different perspectives, describe the fact that one cannot separate sensory and motor aspects of of control systems. So in terms of general broad theoretical challenges, I would say OFC is optimal feedback control, which is the kind of setting of classic control theory. it's usually intractable beyond the simplest settings. So all the types of complexities that were described previously make the general theory of OFC intractable in any practical manner. So the question is, whenever obviously you're doing some kind of modeling, you have to choose what to maintain. And then of course there is the question whether we are still describing the system, whatever the system means. Moreover, we no longer really have a practical notion of optimality because problems are immediately becoming intractable. We have to settle for approximations, and then there is obvious question of which approximation is most reasonable. And as everyone here who's trying to model any kind of system knows, there is this balance one needs to maintain, which are usually in conflict between the experimental relevance and the mathematical tractability. I should say at the outset that the current theory, as I envisaged it in control theory, is still far away from the kind of biological reality that one would like to describe, even conceptually. So let me present the kind of general depiction of a feedback control system consisting of the system to be controlled, actuators acting on it, sensors, and the controller itself. In this talk, I will use the following notation. X will be the state of the system, Y will be the observations, U will be the control signal, and A are the outputs of the actuators. In this talk, I will not distinguish between A and U. In principle, these in a motor system could represent the muscles, the spinal cord, but I will just ignore it at this point, and I apologize to Ivan for that. One other way to describe this system, which has been shown, this kind of graph, is in the temporal domain, where you have the time evolution of the state of the system affected by the control signal, and we have the sensory measurements based on the system observation. Now, optimal control essentially is a way to pick these control signals, UT star, as a function of the previous history of observations, Y, and the previous history of control. So in principle, the problem of optimal control, optimal feedback control, is described by this complex function. Now, in the theory of optimal control, one can show that under pretty broad conditions, one can define what is called a belief state. The belief state is essentially a summary of the information we have about the unobserved state of the world, of the system, given the past history. And the past history in this case is essentially the observations and the previous controls. So in principle, if we knew this belief state under certain Markovian assumptions, you could compute the optimal control. However, as I mentioned, this is an intractable problem in general. So when dealing with intractable problems, one comes up with approximations. Now, the first type of approximation that was proposed many years ago in the control theory literature is the approximation of separation, which, and this idea of separation has been mentioned in Tali's first talk and in other talks, not always in this specific context, but the idea here is that in order to solve this generally intractable problem, you separate the task of state estimation, of estimating the state of the system, and controlling the system. So you really solve two problems independently. First you estimate, then you control. Now, this approach is rarely optimal. It is optimal in the case of linear, quadratic, Gaussian, and some other cases, but it is rarely optimal. Another stricter kind of approximation is something which is called certainty equivalence, where one performs a point estimate of the state and does this independently of the task, and again uses this estimator to control. So the point here is that if you use certain certainty equivalence, you are trying to estimate the state, for instance, the state of your arm you are trying to move, and you are neglecting any kind of uncertainty about your estimate, and you're just plugging it into your controller as if it were the true state of the world.
I'm still puzzled on the separation side. Is it not the case that on BPs, just generic on BPs,
yeah,
you can separate state estimation control?
Yeah, I mean, there's a slight, I mean, if you know the belief state, then you can actually use that to dynamic programming with that.
So just to be clear, separating state estimation control
so
will yield optimal results. without worrying about computational tractability in public.
If you are able to compute the full posterior without any computational issues, you can do that. But when I'm saying state estimation, I'm usually referring to estimating low order moments or something like that. So sure, if you could compute this in a Markovian state, you're done.
MDP is no estimation code.
Right. Yeah, he said POMDPs.
POMDPs is it?
It's in public.
Yeah. Okay, so both these approaches are suboptimal in general. So within this context of separation or certainty equivalence, one replaces this controller by two subcomponents, an estimator and a simplified controller, which is based on your estimator. And again, within certainty equivalence principle, the estimator is just the posterior mean, as an example. So the question is obviously which estimator you should use, because ultimately you are trying to solve a control task. Now an estimator is independent of the task, and the question is, can we make this estimator task dependent so that the specific type of sensory estimation we're doing here depends on your specific task. So actually, this brings me now to the biological motivation for this issue, which is the notion of adaptivity. We know that sensory adaptation and motor adaptation as well are ubiquitous or observed in sensory motor learning and in multiple biological systems. Now, in many cases, and specifically in the example that I will show in a few slides, adaptation is task dependent. So your adaptation depends on the type of task, the type of environment you're in. So the suggestion that I'm going to pursue here is to use adaptive sensors and to adapt these sensors to the specific task that you're trying to solve. So as I said, solving the full closed-loop control problem is intractable, and there's no way we can solve it in a general case. So we're going to use with this separation or even certainty equivalence principle in some cases within the context of adaptive sensors and adapt the sensors to the specific task. So the main results that I'm going to show here is we're going to use separation to study optimal control under certain conditions that I will mention. This is actually optimal, but not in general. And I will discuss task-dependent sensory adaptation, and will present closed-form analytic approximation, which allows us to gain some kind of insight into what this is doing. And in a more general framework, these results extend the current framework for point process-based estimation and control. Obviously, control is a widely studied, with the continuous observations has been widely studied for many, many years. There is far less work on control based on point process observations. So let me start with a brief experimental motivation for, and since I know many of you are not coming from a neuroscience or biology background, I will spend just a minute or two defining basic aspects of sensory receptive fields. So we know that there are multiple types of sensory variables which affect biological systems, like light, sound, odorants, temperature, etc., etc. Now, sensory encoding, and again, I don't like the word encoding in a closed-loop control setting, but I will use it, is the way sensory neurons fire in response to sensory input. So if we, a basic concept here is that of tuning curves. So if we look at a graphical depiction of the visual system, so we have the eyes, the retina information going from the eye through the LGN to the first cortical area. And what we have here, for those who have not seen these kinds of figures, cells in the first visual area here, V1, respond to lines at different orientations. So for instance, this specific neuron responds most vigorously to a line at this angle and responds very little to lines at this kind of angle. So when people describe the response properties of sensory neurons, they display a tuning curve, which the x-axis is the preferred orientation and the y-axis is the average firing frequency of that particular neuron. So if this is the orientation of the input, this particular neuron prefers a 0 degree orientation, and it fires much less at 20 or 30 or 40 degrees. So actually, if you look at the output that is coming from this visual area V1 and going onto the brain for further processing, this is what it looks like. So the x-axis essentially is time, the y-axis is just numbering the different neurons, and what we have here in mathematical terms is just a multivariate point process. This is the input. Now, just as a obvious reminder, the input that is coming from the visual area, the output from the visual area, from auditory areas, from sensory motor areas, it all looks like this, right? There are no smells, sights, or sounds anymore. It's just this multivariate point process. So ultimately, what we would like to do is understand how you can work within a closed-loop control system in order to generate some desired control task. Now, in order to do that, we have to describe what the sensors generating these spikes here look like. So these sensors are, as I showed in the previous class, they often look, they appear like unimodal, Gaussian, or cosine types of tuning curves. In this modeling framework, I will just take them to be Gaussian tuning curves characterized by three parameters. Phi m is the height of the Gaussian, mu m is the width, and alpha is the center of the Gaussian, and alpha m of the width. And you can have different tuning curves at different locations, different amplitudes and widths. So in the context of the visual cells I described, this variable x would be just the orientation of the line, of the input. So theta will denote these variables phi, mu, and alpha. So again, what my modeling assumptions here will be is that the strength of the firing of each sensory cell is described by this tuning curve lambda m, and each one emits a Poisson spiking train or a Poisson process based on this firing rate. And this is a very common modeling assumption in the sensory field. So let's look at the estimation setup. What is the estimation setup? The estimation setup is the one where we have some kind of dynamic variable. It could be an object, it could be the orientation of a line, changing in time, subject to some kind of noise. It could be the position of the hand. So that we have a trajectory. And this trajectory, again, is encoded in these sensory neurons. We have spiking activity which is generated, and within a decoding context, our objective is to take these spike trains and decode the input. In this case, it's quite clear, it's obvious because the firing rate is very high, and it's quite easy to reconstruct the input in this case. So this is in the engineering literature, in the systems theory literature, it's called filtering. In the neural computation literature, it's often called decoding. And one way to actually optimally decode the input would be through computation of the posterior distribution for the state x, given the spiking history and the specific tuning curve parameters. So in the context of these simple tuning curve, these unimodal tuning curves, Gaussian tuning curves, one can think of three types of parameters. For instance, the widths, the locations, the maximal firing rates. Now, one perspective which has been quite common within the neural coding literature in computational neuroscience has been that of uniform coding, whereby all these sensory neurons are assumed to be uniform in the sense of having the same width, the same height, and equally positioned in space. Now, the useful property within this setting is that if you take the sum of all these tuning curves, the sum of the lambda i's, you get a function which is more or less constant. So this has been widely studied. However, a much more powerful approach would be to use non-uniform coding, where you have a situation like this, where the properties, there is no specific a priori reason for the cells to be uniform in that sense, and they most often do not obey this assumption. Now, this allows us to introduce heterogeneity into the population of tuning cells, and actually allows us, for instance, to shift the center of the tuning curves and to vary their widths in different ways, and to get a much richer representation of the sensory signals. Okay, sensory adaptation is an aspect of sensory systems which is widely found, widely observed, and multiple experimental results for that. I will just present one simple result as a motivation for those of you who are not acquainted with this kind of literature from the work of Benucci et al. And they looked at the response properties of orientation selective cells in V1 of cat. And the experiment they did was they flashed images for about 40-50 millisecond duration at random orientations. So if we look at this plot here, the x-axis is time and the y-axis is the tuning width of the particular cell they measured. Up to this time of around 40 to 50 milliseconds, the stimulus was constant, and what they observed that while the stimulus was held constant, the tuning width of the cell responsive to this orientation was diminishing in time. So this is an adaptive property on the time scales of tens of milliseconds that the width of the tuning curve diminishes in time. And actually, in theoretical work which we did before knowing about these experimental results, we predicted within this context of uniform coding this exact kind of decrease of tuning width in time for this kind of setup. And the intuition behind this is very easy because it's very simple, because if you have a constant stimulus and there is noise in the system and you're uncertain about its location, what you would like to do is initially to localize the object in a rough way, and for that you would have a broad tuning curve, and as you become surer and surer of the location, you would like to reduce the width of the tuning curve. Now this brings me to another set of experiments which motivated this work, and this is the sensory shift following motor learning. So the idea here was to observe perceptual changes following motor learning, and particularly human arm movements, although these experiments were done also for speech production. And these are experiments again in the lab of David Ostry at McGill. So this experiment, subjects were asked to move a manipulandum under a certain force field which was applied to their hand. And if there is no force field, people, when they're asked to reach from point A to point B, they usually reach in a straight line. However, in this case, since the force field, the perturbation force field was applied to the hand, the motion is no longer a straight line, and they measured the deviation from a straight line. After having learned to deal with this force field, they tested the sensed position. And what is interesting, we see here day 1, day 2, the initial curvature is larger, and after a few days, then they reached not a straight line, a curved straight line working within this force field experiment. So if we look at the trial number on the x-axis and at the curvature of the movement of the y-axis, if there is no force field, then the curvature is 0. In the face of a force field training, we see that initially the curvature was much larger, and it went down and reached some constant level after a few trials. What they depict here is that if after the experiment they tested the perceptual shift of these subjects, and what happens is that what the subject perceived as the center of their perceptual field changed after the experiment. So this, if you take a person's arm and ask him, is your end point of your hand to the right or to the left of the center of the field, they give you an answer and they plot this kind of response curve. And what you see is that following the experiments, the perceptual boundary shifts opposite to the force field. And this actually persists for 24 hours. So the conclusion from this set of experiments was that sensory adaptation accompanies motor learning, and they actually in later experiments observed physiological changes in sensory cortex following purely motor learning. And I'm sorry, I'm summarizing a large set of experiments very briefly, but I don't have much time to go beyond that. So let me now discuss optimal adaptation in the context of estimation theory. So in this context, we have some kind of variable x evolving in time with some noise and being observed through these spike train point process observations. So within a context of open loop, where your objective is to take in the activity of your neurons here, NT, and to reconstruct the input within an open loop setting, one can think of a reconstruction error here, which could be the MSE, mean squared error. And in this context, we know very well from basic estimation theory that the optimal solution would be the posterior mean for the state given the observations. And then what would be optimal sensory adaptation in this context? Well, optimal sensory adaptation would be to find the sensory tuning of these sensory neurons, which minimizes this reconstruction error. Okay, so let me denote by theta star E, E for estimation, those parameters of the tuning curves which optimize my reconstruction error. Now, in the context of control, things are a little more complicated because you have a system which is subject to a control signal here, U, again being observed through these sensory neurons here. And we have a control cost, which I will not describe in detail here, which is just usually given by an integral across for some fixed n time. Could be, for instance, an integral of the deviation if your objective is to send your arm from some point in space to the origin. It would be the deviation from the origin. So within this closed loop setting, you have your system, you have your observation, and you close the loop through the control signal, which is trying to push your system to some desired position or trajectory. So optimal control in this setting would be the following problem. So C is the cost of deviation from optimality. In this case, perhaps it would be just the cost function of your control problem. So your optimal control would be, in principle, your signal U, which minimizes the expected value of this cost. Now, optimal task-dependent adaptation would be selecting the values of these tuning curve parameters which optimize your control task, not necessarily your estimation problem, your reconstruction. So it's important to distinguish between the problem of reconstructing the input or controlling the input. These are two different things. And in general, the optimal adaptive solution for the estimation and for the control problem are not necessarily the same. Okay, so how do we go about actually computing the optimal estimator? And let me first focus on the open loop setting where we're just trying to reconstruct the signal. So the way one solves these problems usually is through writing down the likelihood function, which is the probability distribution under your model. Given your input signal x, what is the probability for observing a particular set of spikes, n? Now, within the uniform coding setting, which is being widely used in the literature, one assumes that this term is more or less constant. And again, you see, if you take the sum of all these Gaussian curves, these uniform Gaussian curves, this sum is really more or less constant, and you can discard it. Now, what this term really means is that it's written as an integral, but this term really means that it contributes every time there is a spike. This term, you get a contribution from this term. And you don't have to worry about the mathematical niceties of this right now. Now, the analysis becomes particularly simple if we take a Gaussian tuning curves as here. Although the analysis can be extended to other types of tuning curves, it's particularly simple in this case. Now, as I said, in order to solve optimally estimation tasks of various kinds, reconstructing the input, ideally one would like to compute the posterior. So for the simple case where the dynamics of the system is a linear system, just simple linear dynamics, one can actually show that under these conditions the posterior distribution is Gaussian. And then everything becomes very simple, and this is one of the reasons why uniform coding has been so popular in the literature, because things are Gaussian and simple. So in this case, within a dynamic setting, one can show that the posterior distribution of the state given your spiking observations is a Gaussian distribution with mean mu and variance sigma. And actually, if you can write the dynamics here exactly. The first term is just the free dynamics of your underlying model system. And the second term is just, what essentially means here is you have a sum over all sensory neurons, some matrix, it doesn't matter. Every time there is a spike, this term contributes. So mu m is the center of the mth sensory cell. And what this essentially means is that mu is the posterior mean. What it essentially tells you that if your mth cell emits a spike, your posterior is pushed towards that cell. So every time a spike is emitted by one of the sensory cells, it changes your posterior estimate of the position of the state. Now, for those of you who are familiar with Kalman filtering, the first term looks very much like the Kalman filter. The second term is different, but I don't have time to enter into further details of this. And you can actually write down a similar recursive update equation for the posterior variance. The first term is exactly as for the Kalman filter, and the second term depends on the spiking activities of the sensory neurons. Intuitively, what one can show, and it's easy to show in a one-dimensional case, is that every time you get a spike, every time a neuron spikes, your posterior variance decreases, which makes sense because you're gaining information about the state of the world. Now, again, for those of you who are familiar with the Kalman filter, one difference is that this term depends on your actual observation process, which is not the case for the Kalman filter. Okay. So just to demonstrate what one can do with this kind of result in a dynamic context, so just consider a simple motion of a one-dimensional object, which is just a linear dynamics plus noise. Use tuning functions, again, with uniform locations. And one can show, so what I'm plotting here, the x-axis is the alpha, is this parameter, this adaptation variable of the sensory tuning, and this is the MSE for various values of phi. What you can see here is that there is an optimal width which optimizes the reconstruction error in this setting. And actually, one can plot the optimal width of the tuning curve as a function of gamma. Gamma is this dynamic variable. And what essentially this is telling us that if the larger gamma is, the faster this dynamics is. The faster this dynamic is means you want to accumulate more spikes quickly, and therefore you take larger value of alpha, so you have less precision, but you accumulate more spikes. Okay, so this was a motivation of the usefulness of adaptation in context of sensory processing, and there's a huge literature on that. However, I want to go back to control. So the control, let me look at a simple setup where you have a linear dynamical system, you have point process observations, and you have uniform coding. And I will extend the uniform coding assumption shortly. So in this case, as I mentioned, the Gaussian distribution of the posterior is the posterior is actually Gaussian, and Rhodes and Snyder long ago have shown that under this case, certainty equivalence principle actually holds. And in this case, the optimal controller is a linear function of your mean estimate, state estimate. And again, I apologize for this equation, but let me try to interpret. So this is the expected value of the cost for your optimal controller. So the first term is the standard term that appears in the case where you have full information about the system. This is the standard cost to go in the fully observable control problem. The second term here is just some term that depends on the noise. And the third term essentially describes your future uncertainty. This term don't worry exactly about the form, but what it contains here is the integral from your present time up to the future of your variance. So this term is absent when you know the state, but when you do not know the state, this is the explicit contribution of your future uncertainty to your control. So and this is a really important issue because part of your control has to deal with reducing this uncertainty. Okay. So let me just give you a very simple example relating to the difference between estimation and control. So let's say you have a two-dimensional system, maybe the end point of your hand, and you want to move your hand to some location. So let's look at the case where the tuning in this case is two-dimensional. So you have two-dimensional Gaussian tuning curves in this case, and they have widths A1 and A2. And let's consider this kind of cost. So for instance, this would be the cost in pushing your hand to the origin. You see deviation from zero costs you. And the second term is just an energy cost. And let's assume that Q1 is larger than Q2. So what this essentially means is that precision in the one direction is more important than precision in the two directions. So it's more costly. So if you're just doing estimation, then this cost is irrelevant to you. If you're just trying to reconstruct the state, then the optimal estimation in this case would tell you that the two widths A1 and A2 are equal. However, if you actually solve the optimal control problem in this case, you show that A1, that the optimal estimator, that the optimal sensory tuning curve should have A1 smaller than A2. Because it is more costly to make an error in the one direction, you want to have your precision of your tuning in the one direction to have more precision in the one direction. So this really means, in a very simple example, that adaptation differs in a very fundamental way between adaptation and control. Okay, so these results were basically for kind of the standard setting of uniform coding. Now I want to go beyond that. And the motivation for this is the experiments I described previously, which told us that following multi-learning, essentially, there is a shift in your tuning curves. Now this cannot be explained within a uniform coding perspective. So if we go back to this likelihood function, which I displayed previously of this form, in this case you can no longer eliminate this term up here, and the posterior is no longer Gaussian. So the way to get around this technically is to introduce a prior on the tuning curve parameters. Remember, the tuning curves have parameters theta, which could be the width, the locations, etc. And take some continuum limit when the number of tuning cells goes to infinity. So consider this figure where you have, for instance, the dynamics of X, the spikes. This is a tuning curve with center theta. And we have a population of tuning curves which is distributed according to some function f of theta. So one can show in this case, and I will of course not describe any technical details, that the posterior dynamics of the mean of your mean estimate has three terms. The first term is the term coming from the prior. It just describes what you know about the world, your model assumption. The second term is a contribution that arises between spikes, and the third term is a contribution that comes whenever a spike occurs. You can get a similar equation for the update of the variances. And again, these expressions are exact but cannot be computed because they require the full posterior. I should just note that in the case of uniform coding, these blue terms are absent. Now, what is interesting here is that even in these regions between spikes, although you are not getting any spiking information, your information about the posterior is changing. So you are gaining information even though you're not gaining any sensory input between spikes. So, as I said, this problem in general is intractable, and the way to approach it is through an approximation scheme which is called assumed density filtering. I will not, of course, describe it in detail, just saying that what we do is at every point in time we project the posterior onto a Gaussian family and compute the best estimate at each time. Okay, so I will skip some details because I'm running short of time. I just want to tell you we are able to get closed form analytic updates under this approximation. And just to demonstrate that this approximation is a very good approximation, what we plot here is, as a function of time, the posterior mean. What we see in black here is the actual trajectory. The white, the yellow circles are the spikes. And then you see here the result of our ADF filter and the particle filter, which is considered to be one of the best estimators for these kinds of systems, and they're almost identical. So this approximation gives a very accurate result and provides us with closed form analytic formulae. So let me just give a simple illustration of these posterior updates in a one-dimensional setting. So this is the change in my posterior when a spike occurs at position at a sensory cell characterized by the position theta. So what happens as previously, if this cell is spiking and my posterior mean is here, it is pushed towards the cell that has spiked. Now, between spikes, as I told you, in this case, the posterior mean is changing between spikes in the following way. So if mu pop represents the center of my population, remember I have these sensory cell tuning curves, and they are distributed according to subdistribution with a center at mu pop. So what happens in this case, what would you expect? I mean, if my posterior estimate is here and I do not receive any spikes, so what this essentially does is it pushes me away from mu pop. It tells me that my assumption that the center, that most of the tuning curves should be at mu pop, is a bad one, and it shifts it away to the right. So what is interesting here is that you can get an explicit closed form expression for the update of your posterior mean and variance at spikes and between spikes. And as I said, if you're just using uniform coding, this expression is absent. So I will skip the further details and just tell you that actually if you plot as a function of sigma pop, if you compare the MSE in the estimation setting between the situation where you're using uniform coding or you're using non-uniform coding, the blue curve demonstrates that by using non-uniform coding, you're actually improving your estimate quite significantly, and that information is important. So actually, what we would like is to extend these ideas to control, and this is currently underway, but I will show you just some preliminary results in this case, where we're trying to, motivated by the experiments I described previously of Ostri's group, we just have a simple one-dimensional R model. So P is the position, V is the velocity, Newton's equation. This is the external force, this is the control, and the task is to move the hand to the origin with minimal energy. So what we can get in this case is, if you plot, in the case where you have zero external force, this term is absent, if you plot the estimation cost and the control cost as a function of this parameter, which is the population center, the optimal is when the population center is at 0. However, if you are trying to solve this control problem in the face of a force field, and you plot here the control cost and the estimation cost, first of all, you see that the optimum occurs at different values of the parameter. And interestingly, what you see here is that following motor, that being able to solve this motor control problem tells you that the population center of your sensory cells should shift from the origin to some other position, which is consistent with the experimental results which I mentioned previously. So let me just conclude here by saying that optimal sensory adaptation in general should be task dependent, and we've shown that this is the case even in conditions where certainty equivalence holds. And this view is consistent with recent experiments. And again, there are obviously many open issues. I did not discuss the important issue of exploration, which was widely raised here and is obviously of great importance. And other sources of uncertainty, like model uncertainty, communication uncertainty, delays, what have you, many other interesting aspects which are relevant. What I'd like to take away from this is the question whether biology can suggest improved algorithms for control. And this, I think, is a deep question which interests many of us, and I think is still very much open. Finally, I'd like to thank my collaborators, Alex Susmil and Manfred Opper, on earlier parts of this work, and Yuval Aren, who is a PhD student at the Technion, who has been instrumental in developing this non-uniform coding setting and achieving these results I've described. And thank you for your time.